All right, now this video, I probably should have done it a long time ago. I've discussed it. I was gonna do like sort of one of those stand-up videos that I've done, but I wanted to kind of have a longer form video in which I'm able to kind of think points along the way, just so I can more so thoroughly explain it. Now, I've talked about it in my streams. I've talked about it in some of my videos, and how important to me canon is, just continuity when it comes to comics. And this was a big thing for me as far as what was more intriguing when it came to me getting into comics as a youngster, and certainly appreciating them more as I was an adult. I know that there's going to be individuals that are going to be on the opposite end of this than I am, but I just want you to truly hear me out. It's a lot more. Comics, when I read a comic book, to me, just having a mere good story, certainly in this climate, is not enough, right? And that's because the whole lure of the comic books, it's more than that. Of course, that's part of it, but there's other elements that goes into it. Now, this will sort of get you in that mind frame and understanding why I'm not a fan of alternative universes. And alternate universes, for the most part, that is those that exist aside from the main continuity. And that's unfortunately what we have a lot of today, with both, actually, the big two, with DC and Marvel, in that you'll have these sort of side stories. And I can understand why those are maybe intriguing for those who don't maybe read a lot of books. So a limited series that exists on its own may be a little more attractive to them. And to me, that seems like that's the reason why they do that, and why they put those stories out. But when I look at it, I dislike those a whole lot, because those don't matter. I can read a 5-issue limited series. DC is dropping a lot. They have Black Label. They have all of these different side stories that are dropped, but they all exist outside of the main continuity for the most part. So as you're reading it, you may be like, "Oh, this is cool. This is a cool little take." But at the end of it, I'm like, "Well, none of this mattered. It's the end of it. That's it." And that's, to me, again, is because comic books, the lure of it was continuity for me in canon. That is, that the events mattered that happened, right? And you have all of these different stories going on, all these different characters that are all having their own thing going, and they're having their own journeys and such. And sometimes they cross over, and you have these major crossover events. But the thing that I love when you consider the main universes is that those events, for the most part, matter. And that is, that sort of gets us talking, gets us having conversations. Well, you remember back when this character did this, and then, that gets later explained down the line, and so forth. So it's a lot more than just, okay, a good story. It's a good story that matters, where those events have actual impact. And I think certainly in this climate is why you're getting a lot of weird variations and depictions of some characters, not just in live action, but also in the comic books, because that gives them an excuse to do it. Is that, well, it's just a different universe. And so they have these writers that are picked up, probably shouldn't be writing these books at all, but they're writing these little side stories. And again, some of them you may think are good objectively, and I don't necessarily disagree that on their own they may be okay, but some quite often are just these very, very odd depictions of characters, different versions of these characters. And a lot of those events that happen, if they are telling these side stories outside of the main continuity, they don't matter. They don't matter at all. As in, you'll read it and it's exhilarating. You may like it, but by the end of it, you're like, okay, none of that mattered. This character died, doesn't matter. This character had this epic event or this character had this sort of deal that happened that really is it's a game changer. It doesn't matter because it exists outside of the main universe. And that's why, to me, it's a lot more than just a good story. And maybe the reason why I wanted to explain this is because that'll give you some insight in why I criticize some of the things that I criticize when it comes to comics. My thing is, I think there's legacy, there's this canon, there's stuff that we want to make sure gets acknowledged by way of these characters. And I think that having these sort of stories venture off, and there's so many of them, there's too many of them. It'd be one thing they're doing them one off here and there, but there's so many of those sorts of stories that exist that have absolutely nothing to do with anything. It's just Marvel or DC giving somebody a gig to give them a limited series. And I have to, understand that, there's reasons why they do that. And some of that consists of maybe individuals are actually into it. I get people that ask me all the time, hey, have you read this? It's cool little story. I'm like, yeah, it's okay. But the events don't matter. So that's not anything that if somebody's asking me for a good comic book or something like that, that wouldn't be a book that I would recommend for them. Because again, to me, the biggest part of, certainly when we're talking about the main two and these comic book characters, is that there's this universe that exists, and all these characters are in it. They're having their own things going, and most importantly, those events matter. They have to be taken into consideration no matter who the next writer is that's writing an upcoming book or anything like that. Those events have to be taken into consideration because it happened. It's part of that legacy of that character. So that's where it is to me, and that it's a lot more actually than just a good story to me, which is why maybe you don't see me have these, and I read them, those little side stories. I've read a lot of them. I was talking about Deceased the other day. And some of these different sort of stories, but they don't really have any bearing on the main universe, so it doesn't matter. So I can read this alone and maybe chat about it, but it's not anything as intriguing to me as reading something that I know is going to have to stick. And this is where we sort of separate the talented writers from the writers that are just writing random characters, and that the greatest writers are able to write new, fresh, exhilarating stories while taking into consideration everything that happens in these books. Before they were picked up to write this particular character, quite often a character that they did not obviously create. And those are the best writers, are the ones that are able to say, all right, I know about this character. They've experienced this, and this. I'm going to tell a new story, taking it into consideration, so the character's going to feel like the character. And that, to me, is what matters. So while a good story to me in current comic books is a thing that's very important, it's not the only thing that's important if it's something that's going to make me take it seriously, and that is, it has to exist, and the events have to matter, because that, to me, I can read billions of other stories, novels and such. If I wanted to read a story that stood alone by itself, the lure with the comic books and why I fell in love with them is because I could read this and I know that it matters, and it shapes and impacts the characters that are within it.